Welcome to Breakpoint this week. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, just so you know, I plan on going into isolation on a small island I know of here on the west coast of Florida until this election is over. And then afterwards, I'll kind of catch up on the highlights reel because I honestly can't take an election in a year like 2020. It's just too much.
Well, I think that's a feeling a lot of people have. I think there's a sense. I was interviewed earlier, even today, for a broadcast that'll air on another radio program in a couple weeks, and they played some man on the street interviews or people on the street interviews. I'll be
Don't be
politically
sexist.
correct there. And there is this sense, like there's you feel like you can't say what you believe out loud or you'll get canceled by one side or the other. We face kind of an impossible choice, all kinds of things. But really the headline this week by the pick by Joe Biden of Kamala Harris as his running mate is really just a reminder of, what the center portion of the Democratic Party is right now. And, this is where they are.
Well, the surprising part to me, John, was probably the media reaction, where Kamala Harris is someone who's not been without controversy in her time in office, and of course, she goes back to, police work. She was a DA, and she was pretty fierce in her prosecution, and so she's not. On paper, she's not on the right side of a lot of the debates on, or the left side, I should say, who many would consider the correct side of many of the debates going on this year. And yet here she is at the bottom of the ticket here for the Democratic nominee for president. That really surprises me. But I also see a really rapid shift in both Kamala Harris and Joe Biden from the centrists that they've been, at least speaking in terms of the Democratic Party, for their entire political careers, now a lurch hard left. And I understand that's something that typically happens during the primary season, but we're past primary season now. We are in really the lead up to the general election, and yet these candidates are really pandering hard to the left end of their party. So that's an interesting thing to note right there.
Well, it is. And there was plenty of people that said, never, will I support a Biden ticket with Kamala Harris, but they are, right? Sean King,
Right.
For example,
Including Kamala Harris.
Yeah, right. But we're right. Yeah. I mean, they were not friends on the debate stage back in the Democratic primaries. That's for sure. Remember debate stages? Are we going to get to see any of those? That's another question.
I don't think I've seen any group of more than like 10 people together in one place since February.
But we have Sean King, who's a pretty progressive. I don't know if he's a blogger or basically has a pretty big Twitter following, but 2018 essentially said, I won't support any ticket that has Biden or Harris on it, and now he's got a ticket that has both of them, and very quickly said, this is a great ticket, one of the best we've ever seen from the Democratic Party. But this is the position that we all get forced into at some level. Is what's that pragmatic decision we're going to make to support things that we don't, fully get behind. And, I think voters on both sides feel like they have to do that literally each and every time. But at the same time, it is important to note, where these parties now land. The Democratic Party, when it comes to abortion rights, in particular, when it comes to kind of the perspective of religion, and Joe Biden has said that the transgender issue is the great civil rights cause of our day. So this is where the party itself is, just to be clear. And we need to, I think we need to be clear on that front, because we can forget these things, and elections matter, as we have, said before.
Well, Harris has made her particular position on abortion especially clear. At least she's made an effort to run in a dramatically leftward direction on that since the primary season. If you remember, she was actually the first candidate on the stage there, you were talking about earlier, to support what's called pre-approval for state abortion laws, federal pre-approval. So basically an effort to, through some, legal jiggery-pokery, as a former justice might have called it, to set about subjecting every state level abortion law or proposal to federal approval, which would in essence, nationalize the whole issue. And that's become that's become a mainstream Democratic position now. And so that's what I mean, and that's what you mean by the run toward extremism, toward the left end of the party. And that's something that in various ways you see in both parties, which is just odd, because I remember growing up watching elections, like, when Bill Clinton was running, how he would sort of run pandering to the left as a candidate, and then, or as a candidate during the primary season, and then when general election came around, he wanted to portray himself as a centrist who was going to be speaking for all Americans, as it were. But it doesn't seem like that's the case here. I think it feels like a lot of those on the left believe that they can ride this wave of hard left sentiment into office. And in a way, Kamala Harris's selection as vice presidential candidate, it reinforces that, because you really can't say that race and sex did not play a significant role in that selection. And there were many who were saying, leading up to the decision, that, well, Vice President or former Vice President Biden has to pick, an African-American woman to be his vice presidential nominee. And that is interesting how that's becoming entrenched in the Democratic Party.
Oh, well, yeah, that was definitely a big part of it. I mean, I'm, not to say that, at least as far as Democratic bona fides go, that she doesn't qualify, but that wasn't, an upfront category. And so that is an interesting thing. But it's also a question, and I think it remains to be answered. I think there are many people who think that the Democratic platform on abortion is not where the vast majority of Americans are. And I think that's probably right. But we also have some recent studies, including from a Notre Dame study, How Americans Understand Abortion, where the schizophrenia here is not being where the Democratic platform has now landed, which is a long way away from safe, legal, and rare from a former day. Not being comfortable with late-term abortion, not being comfortable with out parental notification laws and some other common sense regulations, but just the allergy that Americans have to impose morality on anyone else. And this has long been a framework that has limited the pro-life movement in America. It's not that we don't have the better arguments. It's not that we don't have the images from the ultrasounds. We have all that stuff, right? We've actually got the textbooks, the embryology textbooks that tell us things like, when life begins and other essential questions. But where all of this is being done in a framework of relativism, where there's a big difference between saying, I think abortion's wrong, and I think that I can impose that view or suggest that view, or we should put that view somehow in law. And that sort of inability to understand the gravity of the issue, I don't know, even if it's the inability to understand the gravity of the issue as much as this is the power of moral relativism as embedded in the American psyche, which, for the record, of course, is inconsistent, because we're morally certain that everyone should believe the same thing about, other things that we're dealing with, justice issues.
Right.
So it's largely inconsistent, but that's what's going to be interesting in this coming election season, is how these views are going to play themselves out. And not only in the national election, we've been talking about the presidential ticket, but, we have in Colorado, for example, a ballot initiative about late-term abortion. Colorado is one of the 9 states left that still has late-term abortion, and has a late-term abortionist who is very active and is getting very rich by killing little babies just before they're born, after 22 or 23 weeks. So it's going to be interesting to see, and it's also going to be a clarifying moment for the work that remains to be done by those of us who who defend life. This is going to be a very telling election as far as that goes.
John, you talk about imposing moral views on others. And the interesting thing about that sentiment is that it quickly becomes an imposition of moral views on others. The revulsion against imposing your views ends up inevitably creating victims down the road, where the best example I can think of is this abortion issue. And you see what happens after generation and generation, of this sort of thinking. We see that in a new poll out of Belgium, actually, where it found that so-called after-birth abortion, or basically infanticide for babies with a disability, is supported by more than 9 out of 10 Belgian physicians who were surveyed. And this shocking new research paper into abortion attitudes was actually conducted by professionals in Flanders, Belgium. They found that 93.6% of physicians surveyed agree, this is a quote, that in the event of a serious non-lethal neonatal condition, administering drugs with the explicit intention to end neonatal life is acceptable. So while the term serious non-lethal neonatal condition is kind of fuzzy, it's not actually defined there. Similar wording, like very much like this in the UK Abortion Act, in practice allowed for the abortion of babies with things like cleft lip, Down syndrome, club feet, non-lethal conditions that would allow them to, nonetheless live a long and otherwise normal life, are being put forward as grounds for killing them. Not just in this case shortly before birth, as you mentioned, but now at least, and this isn't a legal proposal as of yet, but apparently it has overwhelming support from doctors in Belgium. That
94%. I mean,
94%.
first of all, can we just go back and just remind everyone that the most important question you can keep in your back pocket at this time in our cultural moment is, what do you mean by that? Because the euphemisms that get tossed around in order to take certain ideas forward are stunning. We talked recently about, euphemisms like sex affirmation surgery or gender affirmation surgery, which is literally the exact opposite of what the word should mean. And here we have a euphemism like after birth abortion. Just think about that. Just what a euphemism, after birth abortion. You're right. I mean, what that is it's infanticide. By the way, Shane, I learned of this study from a very dear friend of mine who I haven't seen in a long time, but is from New Zealand, who himself has a disability, is one of the most brilliant guys that I know, and is a leader in the pro-life movement in New Zealand. And by the way, if you're a pro-life leader in America and you think you've got it rough, go to New Zealand, where they just passed, using COVID as cover, the most liberal abortion laws on the planet. Because my friend who has long advocated against doctor-assisted suicide, another issue in New Zealand, against abortion, it sees this and he realizes that young people like him, right, when he was born at 30 weeks, he was born with a disability, he would have never lived. And I'm just going to tell you, I haven't seen John in a while, but I'm telling you right now, the world would be a worse place without John on it, because of his brilliance, his love, his service, and this valuing of life is stunning. The other thing I said about this story this week, Shane, which is really important, is you think, how does this happen? How could 94% of doctors get to this point? And the reality is, some ideas make other ideas thinkable. It's from abortion to doctor-assisted suicide. By the way, Belgium has the most liberal doctor-assisted suicide laws on the planet. Has moved now from non-lethal conditions. Has moved now from lethal conditions to non-lethal conditions, to parental consent or patient consent to non-consent, kind of fuzzy on all those categories. People can give consent like 2 or 3 years ahead. They can put it in their end of, life wishes, all kinds of different things. Once you start devaluing one life, you have lost the capacity to properly value any life. And that's where this one's landing.
Well, yeah, it flows from the same premises as the right to die argument, that there's someone who their life is no longer worth living.
Right.
By the way, that's a phrase with a history, and so they can choose to end their life. Well, that quickly and sort of inevitably becomes, and everywhere we've seen these laws enacted, a duty to die, where some people now should go ahead and get out of the way and stop making other people's lives inconvenient. And that then gets applied to newborn children and justified as this after birth abortion, when it's infanticide. It's Spartan. It's a return to one of the greatest horrors of the ancient world that Christianity sort of extirpated from its from civilization, as it touched and transformed people's thinking. But now, after Christianity has sort of faded away in Western Europe and Scandinavia and the Netherlands and the many of those countries in Western Europe just have they've gone so far in this direction. It's almost like they're several generations ahead of us in terms of being post-Christian, and you see the results begin to flower there, the ugly results of no longer having Christian thinking, because it was Christians originally who came up with this radical idea that you shouldn't be able to get rid of inconvenient or crippled babies. That you
Right, and
had to take care
it
of
was
them.
based on that moral sense that we were able to condemn some of the great historical evils. Right, it's
Sure.
based on that same moral sense that you do that. But we have a short memory, and I think we're deeply infected. And we need to think some more about this, Shane, and maybe bring some folks in to think with us about this. But I think there is an unbelievable danger of moral evolution. In other words, thinking that somehow because we're more sanitized maybe, or we're more, I don't know, educated,
Mm.
that we are less evil, that we're clearly morally progressing. And we justify that, of course, along the lines of, our tolerance and inclusivity. I was with one of the, leaders of the Babylon Bee just a week or so ago, and I told him I always think that their headlines that are actually true and aren't satire at all are actually the best, right? And the headline that nation that kills millions of babies a year thinks itself morally superior to those that own slaves,
Mm.
and you're like, well, there you go. I mean, this literally is not satire. That is a absolutely true description of the way things actually are. I think we're going to have to, as Christians, figure out ways to teach our culture about human sin and the fall, because this moral evolution, this deeply embedded idea of moral evolution, is it's providing covers for some grave, grave evils.
Absolutely. Well, folks, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this to talk about more of the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us. We're back here on Breakpoint this week talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, there was another story this week that ended up capturing a lot of attention, and I hope it captures more attention, because this is about an issue that we've talked about extensively on this program, and something that's been tremendously important in our public discourse in this country, and that is the issue of freedom of speech. Not just freedom from coercion by the government, but freedom in the sense that we tolerate one another, we listen to one another, we prefer debate to silencing and cancel culture. And that was a statement. It's called the Philadelphia Statement, that came out just a few days ago on free speech and civil discourse, and it made its public debut earlier this week. Philadelphia Statement counters social media mobs, cancel culture, campus speech policing, and I'm reading from the website here, by clearly articulating and affirming the principles of free speech and the need for civil discourse. And I've signed it, you've signed it. Some of the language here is very much parallel to the Harper's open letter on cancel culture and free speech. And it's a call, once again, to return to civil discourse in an age when it seems like debate has devolved into an effort to simply cancel people you disagree with.
Yeah, there's to paraphrase Solomon, to the writing of statements, there is no end. And
You don't
we've been
normally
guilty.
sign statements for that
Well,
reason, among others.
yeah, I mean, part of it is I think the Colson Center, Chuck Colson, has been behind some of these statements, and there's a desire to say things in our own words. I thought this one was just hugely important, and I was honored to be among the original signatories with, an illustrious group. I told the folks who were behind it, I was like, man, what a great lineup. Present company excluded. I kind of feel, hidden. Rightly hidden among some giants that are on this list. Interestingly enough, too, there's, this is not completely out of step with the Harper statement, right, that came out just a few weeks ago, which was basically claiming from the left, although we would say, some of those who signed that statement are guilty of the things, that they were saying. But
Would you say this is like the right-wing equivalent or the conservative equivalent of that statement?
I just think it's really important that, and here's one of the things that guides us at the Colson Center, Shane. And this, we have 4 questions that we often ask. We teach our Colson fellows to ask, and we want to shape what we do on Breakpoint and what we do on podcasts and so on. What's good that we can promote and protect, what's evil that we can fight and stop, what's missing that we can contribute, and what's broken that we can restore. And listen, free speech, the ability to wrestle, and in fact, let me read what this says. If we seek a brighter future, this is from the statement, the Philadelphia Statement, we must relearn a fundamental truth, that our liberty and our happiness depend upon the maintenance of a public culture in which freedom and civility coexist, where people can disagree robustly, even fiercely, yet treat each other as human beings, and indeed as fellow citizens, not mortal enemies.
Mm.
That's an important thing. That's a good idea. Now, of course, we would say, listen, there's no source for that in history. There's no reason you should give any sort of quarter to anybody who disagrees with you unless there's something uniquely distinguishable about their value that is rooted in something beyond their opinions or beyond their race or beyond their gender or beyond, what their self-identification on a million categories are. And that is that they're made in the image and likeness of God. And because we believe that, because we believe that people are independently related to God, right? Not because they're a part of a group, but that because God has shared his image with us, then that means that their freedom of thought and their freedom of speech, should be respected, that their highest allegiance isn't to a government or to a state or to my ideas of what they should or should not say, but to God
Well, yeah,
himself.
and there's two levels to this, John. The one is the pragmatic level, because as the statement says, a society that allows people to be shamed into self-censorship will not last for long. And that's a historically true statement. Like, if you don't have debate, if you can't come together and talk about things, then self-government falls apart. You can no longer have a society. You just start fighting with each other, or you break up and go your separate ways. That's a very true pragmatic statement. It's something that we all need to recognize. If for no other reason than the continued existence of our self-governing society, we've got to learn to talk to each other and stop shutting debate down. The second reason is a principled reason, and this is something that Christians, I think, should uniquely be able to embrace. In Vishal Mangalwadi's book, it's called The Book That Made the World, or The Book That Made Your World, and it's about the Bible. It's sort of a historical survey of the influence of the Bible on Western civilization. And he points to early on in church history, thinkers like Tertullian and Lactantius, who articulated this very modern-sounding reasoning for religious liberty in particular, but freedom of speech and expression in general. The idea that you can go out there and worship as you choose, believe as you choose, and then actively try to persuade other people of your beliefs. And their reasoning was that, Christ tried to persuade others. He appealed to man's heart and man's reason, not to man's instinct for self-preservation. And they said that a conversion on the basis of force would not be a valid conversion, and the Holy Spirit doesn't work that way, and God doesn't want us to make those kinds of converts. And so that's a Christian heritage that we haven't always been faithful to as Christians and as the church, but certainly is part of our DNA, and that expressed itself ultimately. Mangalwadi makes the case, and others have made the case, in this heritage of Western religious liberty and freedom of speech, that we should be persuading people. We shouldn't be forcing people to adopt our position.
Yeah, that's right. And it is a tragic thing whenever the church is not distinct from the world, right? And one of the ways that the church right now is mimicking the world is as the temperature goes up in a debate, from those who aren't in Christ, then it happens that the temperature goes up on our side. If they yell at us, we yell back. I'm just stunned. And then that creates this whole kind of milieu that we're in, that this statement, the Philadelphia statement, is trying to address. And, folks, I encourage you to go and read this statement. You can come to breakpoint.org. We'll link it there. It's also found at the Philly Statement, thephilystatement.org, and you can see the list of signers, as well as read the document itself. And it really is I think an important statement. And at one level, this is just an attempt to take a truth of Proverbs and apply it to our cultural moment. We've talked about this before, how revolutionary basic Proverbs can be, right? I mean, this is the genius of the Christian book of Proverbs, the biblical book of Proverbs, is that it's not this esoteric religious nonsense that you can't understand, like in the Upanishads or something like that. This is like, basic wisdom that is like profound. Like, a soft answer turns away wrath. I mean, in one sense, this is what this is. No one's saying a soft head turns away wrath, or a softly reasoned, statement or whatever. But there's this, there's this idea that, if I'm louder, then I'm more convicted about what I believe, or if I'm angrier, therefore, that I'm more faithful. And none of that's true. In fact, that anger and uncertainty oftentimes comes from a lack of confidence about what is true and what isn't. And I think that there is, as we said, I think just recently, I think on a Q&A session this week, a profound ability of humans to suppress the truth. But there is an ability, I think, that we can have to be convinced of what's true, and then to articulate that, and then, let's have this conversation. Let's do it. That's what this statement calls for. I'm excited to be a part of it, and I hope that our listeners will go and read it and consider signing it as well.
And of course, we'll link you to that at breakpoint.org in the show notes for Breakpoint this week. Well, we've got time for one more story here, John, and this was something that we tackled on Breakpoint earlier this week in a commentary, but it's something that's related to the conversation that we just had about freedom of speech and cancel culture, because one of the things that's just aggravating this attitude that we need to cancel and shut down and deplatform anybody who disagrees with us is online mobs, particularly in social media. And there was a Pew sort of a compilation of all of existing studies. So they went back and analyzed a bunch of different surveys that they had done, and announced earlier this week that those who rely most on social media for political news tend to be less likely than other news consumers to closely follow major news stories. And they actually confirmed this by giving them a current sort of political quiz about what's going on in the election. They found that those who relied primarily on Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms for their news were not only poorly informed as compared to others about the election news, but they were actually more prone to know about and even believe conspiracy theories, like the idea that Bill Gates wants to inject us with microchips, or that or what was the other one that they cited, or the 5G coronavirus is caused by 5G cell phone technology. And so this is really fascinating to me, because I see what's going on Twitter. I watch people get shouted down and ratioed all the time, as the saying goes. You get more comments than you get, or more replies than you get likes and retweets. And that's the online version of what's fueling this. In fact, when we talked about Barry Weiss's resignation letter a couple of weeks ago from the New York Times, one of the things she cited was Twitter. She said that Twitter has become the de facto editorial board of the New York Times, and that basically they watch in real time how articles are playing on Twitter, and then they modify them or change the titles or something like that based on how angry the reaction there is. So in other words, social media is making us less well informed. It's making us dumber, angrier, more paranoid, and just poor at following the news. So that connection there is fascinating to me. So tell us what you said on Breakpoint, because I think it was very important.
Well, almost everything reminds me of T.S. Eliot these days. So, and I've been for the last several years, I've been quoting a passage from a play that he helped write called The Rock, and it comes from the choruses section of that. But it's just an astonishing thing to think, especially when you remember that he wrote this in 1934. Where is the life we've lost in living? Where's the wisdom we've lost in knowledge? Where's the knowledge we've lost in information? Mm-hmm. In our book, A Practical Guide to Culture, that's one of the things that Brett Kunkel and I argue, that it's not just that there's a lot of information. It's not just that there's false information, and that the false information gets hidden up, amongst the true information, and you got to tell the difference. Right. It's that in an information age, having access to information can be easily confused with being smart or being wise, right? In other words, what it means to know actually fundamentally changes. Yeah. When I was a kid and it was like, look it up, it meant go to a book. And today, look it up means something completely different. But going to a book meant you started at page 1 and went to page 2 and went to page 3. And there was this catechism that happened without even intentionality of cause and effect. Like what happens on this page leads to this page.
That's linear thought.
It's linear.
We forgot how to think in a linear manner because we're jumping back and forth.
But yeah, that's what I'm saying, is that there's actually not a resource, certainly not what we look it up in today, which of course is Google. There's no concept. There's no catechism for linear thought. And that's why, I sometimes talk to parents and grandparents. I'll be speaking to a group of grandparents in just a couple weeks at one of our friends called the Legacy Coalition, really a remarkable group there. But about some of these things. And that's one of those things. We look at younger generations and think, why can't they connect cause and effect? We look at some of the really bizarre things said in light of some of the social justice movements of our day. It's some of justifying some of the riots, and we think this is cause, this is effect, this is A, this is B. What are you missing about this connection? But part of it has to do with how we think and how we know in the information age. And this article or this study about that you're actually are less smart if you spend your time on Twitter. I mean, I actually tell people this all the time. If you're on Twitter, you can follow me at JB Stonestreet. I post things and I make comments and so on. And if you're not on Twitter, don't start. It's actually not worth your time. We've talked before. It's not even real life. It gives you the impression.
Yeah.
It's amazing that Twitter's that effective in canceling people outright when it really just involves so little of the population anyway. But it's a powerful tool. In fact, I heard a really fascinating conversation this week with Jack Dorsey on the New York Times, where on the Daily, they were questioning him and asking him some of these questions.
This is the founder of Twitter.
The founder of Twitter. It's a fascinating conversation. You know, the Arab Spring would not have happened to the same degree without Twitter. At the same time, Twitter makes us dumber. And who's responsible? Is it Twitter or is it us? And the answer, of course, is yes, it is. The fall runs through Twitter and the fall runs through the human heart. So a lot to be learned. I would encourage folks to take a look at this breakpoint, which you and I put out this week on this, the knowledge that's lost in information. Among the resources we mentioned is the book, A Practical Guide to Culture, and the new Student Guide to Culture, both of which help address this issue as one of the big undercurrents of our day, but especially if you're a parent or a grandparent.
I like the way you drew from that, John, especially that one chapter was extremely meaningful for me as a dad of young kids, because you pointed out that children are often, not just children, but teenagers in particular, are often sort of sidetracked by ideas that aren't even impressive, claims that aren't even tough to refute. And their faith can be on the rocks just because of some claim that any apologist worth his salt would be able to take apart in minutes. And that's because mere information isn't knowledge. It isn't a wisdom, much less a perspective on which ideas are good and defensible and right and deserve to stand the test of time, and which ideas are just sort of garbage that's been thrown up on social media. So learning to
and because it's so image driven. Yeah, because it's so image driven as well.
Yeah.
Kids can absolutely believe Christianity is true, but walk away from it because it has an image problem, because it's not, tolerant or inclusive or something like that. I mean, how many times have we heard that, it's why we did our Wilberforce weekend last year on, is Christianity still good for the world, not just true. So yeah, you're right. And this is a big task for parents. It's a big task. It's a big task for me. I mean, we're working through this ourselves, knowing these things are true and trying to apply them and help people, understand them. Well, Shane, for all those who are listening to us today on the podcast, I want to offer a kind of a new little segment. We're going to end this. It's an Easter egg. In other words, if you really want like the golden part of this podcast each and every week, you got to stay to the end, where we give our, I don't know what we call it, our recommendations, like things that you should know about or engage in or something like that. Could be something we read, could be something we watched. Shane, I'm going to give you first shot at it.
Okay. So my recommendation this week would be based on a conversation I had for the new Upstream podcast with a guy named Joe Rigney. He's a professor out at Bethlehem College, closely associated with John Piper. Many will know that. Joe Rigney is kind of the Lewis guru. He's a big C.S. Lewis aficionado. He's a scholar who's very respected on the subject, and but he's put out a new book that's not actually about C.S. Lewis, although it does draw copiously from his work. You can kind of see Narnian fingerprints all over it. And I had a conversation with him about this. It's called Strangely Bright, and it's really a response to the common Christian idea that many of us grew up with, that, as the hymn says, when we turn our eyes upon Jesus and look full in his wonderful face, the things of earth will grow strangely dim.
You're about to get in so much trouble.
I know.
No. I've used that example. I get in so much trouble.
Right.
Listen, it's dangerous to sacrifice sacred cows in public.
Yeah.
I love that song. I say I love this song. It means a lot to me. I agree with almost all of it, but that whole, and the things of earth, if you, you're going to get hammered. Send those emails directly to Shane.Morris.
It's okay. Well, that's not the real email address. So thank you, John, for insulating me from.
I was protecting you.
Thank you. But yeah, I mean, this book is a response to that idea, even in beloved hymns that we have, that as you grow closer to Jesus, you will draw further away from the joys and pleasures and good things of this world, whether that be your family or he talks about, the taste of a good pecan pie or something like that. The being outside on a summer's day at the beach, or in the fall among the leaves with the crisp air, anything like that we just take so much simple delight in. Those are the things that C.S. Lewis talks about in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. And he says that he was actually drawn to God through all of the joyful experiences in his life, beginning with a little tin of a little garden in a cookie tin that his brother Warney had made him. And that was his first experience with joy. He felt there's something special here, and he followed that, and it ultimately led him to God. Well, Joe Rigney is arguing that the opposite is true, that we actually can follow Lewis's route and draw closer to God through those things. Now, he's very careful to balance the Bible's testimony on this issue, where between what he calls the totalizing passages, where there are passages that say it pales in comparison to Jesus. If you need anything besides him, then you are committing idolatry. That, Jesus says, if anyone follows me and doesn't hate his mother and father and brother and sister, then he's not worthy of the kingdom of God. And those are the totalizing passages, the things that tell us to abandon worldly pursuits. But then there are the passages that say to thank God for his good gifts, that, as James said, he's the father of lights and every good thing comes from him. And the celebration of married love that we find throughout Scripture, all of these different passages paint a picture of drawing close to God through embracing his gifts and receiving them with thankfulness. Now, Joe says there's a way to harmonize these two, and that's the subject of his book, how to view the pleasures and joyful experiences of this life that are earthly, the things of earth, in a way that draws us closer to Jesus and makes them, as he says, strangely bright, where we actually become more keenly aware of all of God's gifts because we're drawing close to him through those gifts. And he said it's really a matter of priorities, is what he told me in the podcast. And I recommend you listen to the whole conversation because it's great. But he talks about how if we place God on his throne where he's supposed to be and approach our gifts with a posture of gratitude, where we're recognizing where they come from, who they come from, why we have them, then we'll actually be able to enjoy not only the gifts, but God himself more. And this is a very, Piperish thing to say. John Piper's Desiring God is one of the big classics in the Reformed world. And it's a classic for a reason, because although he uses some language that trips people up, his ultimate point is that our greatest good is synonymous with God's greatest glory, and that we will ultimately find our joy if we pursue our desire for that, for that joy to its final end. If we don't settle for anything less, if we don't settle for making mud pies in the slums, as Lewis said. And then in the last part of his book, he gets into, what do you do if you have a lot, if you're wealthy in this world, if you've been given great gifts? And he talks about generosity and how we enjoy those through giving them to others. He talks about what happens when you are bereft of a gift that you deeply love, especially a loved one, someone who was strangely bright for you in this world, but whom you've lost, and how in Christ you have this transcendent hope of receiving that person back in a way that someone who doesn't believe in the giver of good gifts in Christ, in God, can't. They don't have that ability to look ahead to something better, to a permanent enjoyment of those gifts. So I just recommend the book a lot. I recommend the conversation I had with Joe Rigney. It was great. We were able to connect over a lot of stuff, and there were altogether too many C.S. Lewis references in the conversation. So I hope you'll check that out. You'll really enjoy it.
Well, I love that recommendation. As someone who, to paraphrase the late, great Michael Bauman, has become a sworn enemy of Gnosticism in all of its forms. And I think that's what every Christian should do. What a great recommendation. And by the way, after you're done reading that book, or maybe before reading that book, sing together the hymn, "This is my Father's world," and just contrast that with
favorite.
"Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus," and you'll see. But what both are great songs. Just one needs to be tweaked a little bit. It's a great recommendation. I love that recommendation. My recommendation for today, other than the Philadelphia Statement, which I think people should absolutely read and engage with, is a podcast episode that our good friend and producer Steve Ryder was part of. Steve, of course, has long been helping us do the audio engineering part of this and getting it out, and works with a lot of different Christian organizations. Does a great job for us. But we told his story, and the story that had to do with the medical procedures and the hospital policies during COVID, and how that led to a separation from his wife 3 weeks before she passed away. He tells that story on the Babylon Bee podcast. And that episode of the Babylon Bee podcast with our friend Steve Ryder is worth listening to. And while we're mentioning podcast episodes, since your recommendation was to actually sell your own podcast, which I'm going to actually sell it for you. Shane's new podcast, Upstream, is absolutely tremendous. Make sure you go and listen to that. And while you're there, also check out another new offering from the Colson Center. We've got what we're calling the Colson Center Podcast Network. It's fantastic. Not only the Breakpoint podcast, not only Shane's Upstream, but I'm particularly drawn to the Strong Women podcast, hosted by my wife, Sarah Stonestreet. And
I was going to say, I can't imagine why you're drawn to it.
Well, I tell you what, she and Aaron planned this thing out well. You have complained, rightfully so, that our culture's understanding of femininity is that femininity is women are only great if they act like men. So we got to turn all of our superheroes into, dudes.
Right.
The vision behind this was to, in a culture that so misses what makes women great, is not just to condemn second and third wave feminism in all of its forms, which you and I do plenty of in various times, but to highlight the God-given brilliance of feminine strength, women who are great, not in spite of or despite of being women, but because they are. In fact, one of their first guests is Molly Hemingway. Molly tweeted this week, "I had a great time discussing my faith in Christ with the wonderful Sarah Stonestreet and Aaron Kunkel on their Strong Women podcast, which just debuted." So great shout out on that. We're hearing great feedback on the Strong Women podcast. So I think I cheated, not one recommendation, gave you 3, but I'll play by the rules next week.
I'll come next week with a whole slew of recommendations so I can outdo you.
Well, your one recommendation went on for about 10 minutes there, so we're going to have to retime this baby.
Sorry about that. Well, that wraps it up for today. Come to breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories we've mentioned today on the program, as well as a wealth of commentaries, videos, podcasts, and articles to help you think and live in a distinctly Christian way in today's culture. And you can find both of those podcasts that we mentioned in this segment there at breakpoint.org. Thanks so much for listening. For John Stonestreet, for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.